She was the second child in the family of 22. So
22. We better explain that.
Yeah.
He didn't have 22 children with one wife.
He had 4 wives.
Right. Have I water in here?
No. I can leave the water over here beside you. Sorry. Nah. Go for it.
This is where you regret doing this. I have no doubt whatsoever about it. I'm going to end up looking like.
You look lovely.
I think I need one up there. Right,
Don't get me started.
The green man. There we go. All right, okay. We'll go off and see this other flat.
We will.
The place that I'm in today has 2 names, both sanctioned by officialdom at one time or another. The older name is Mostrum, derived from the Irish Mastrum, meaning the front tier of the elder tree. The other name denotes ownership by an Anglo-Irish family who first settled in these parts in the late 1500s. The great Irish place name scholar John O'Donovan, when reporting back to his Ordnance Survey employers in Dublin in 1837, wrote of this second name. I find no authority for calling the parish by this name save one. We must adopt the name Mostrum unless we wish to be laughed at. 100 years would pass before anyone followed O'Donovan's dictum, but the fact that no one laughed in the interim is perhaps a measure of the fame and the regard that came to be attached to the family name in question. Welcome then to Edgeworthstown in the parish of Mostrum in County Longford. John O'Donovan's entirely proper mission, to which he was fiercely committed, was the restoration of original ancient Gaelic townland names throughout the length and breadth of the country. So we would not have been inclined to regard eponymous Anglo-Irish families as legitimate sources in the place-naming business. What he had to contend with in this instance was that it was de facto Edgeworthstown, in the sense that they more or less owned it. And Maria Edgeworth, who was still alive in 1837, albeit in her late 60s, was one of the most famous authors in the world, up there alongside Jane Austen, William Wordsworth and Sir Walter Scott, with whom she would have been on first-name terms, and she was held in high esteem in this place. So Edgeworthstown it remained, and even though Mostrum was eventually adopted officially and is used nowadays by various organisations and businesses, it has always been overshadowed by its more illustrious companion. But if celebrity based on genuine achievement is what justifies the name Edgeworth being attached to the town, then Maria is only part of the story, because there were other Edgeworths of considerable substance who might contribute to that celebrity, if only we knew more about them. This man's current mission in life is to ensure that we do. Matt Farrell has recently been awarded the accolade Heritage Hero of 2017 by the Heritage Council of Ireland. And among his many contributions to the life of this town, he has led the transformation of the old rectory at St John's Church of Ireland into an Edgeworth museum, wherein you can immerse yourself in Maria's world and meet some of the outstanding characters in that family's history. Maria's own father, Richard Lovell Edgeworth, is one such. But we're going to begin with the extraordinary story of Henry Essex Edgeworth, who was born in this rectory in 1745, but who died in France 62 years later as the Abbé Henri Essex de Fermont. When he was about 4 years old, his father, Robert Edgeworth, the rector of St John's, gave up wrestling with his conscience and made a decision that in those days was not only life-changing, but also life-endangering.
He converted to Catholicism And you can imagine at that time he had to he would leave Edgeworthstown, leave his estate, and went to Toulouse in France. And that's where real history began, because his son, who was born here and lived here until the age of 5, studied in the Sorbonne in Paris and administered to the poor in Paris. And his exploits as a priest were discovered by the royal family. First of all, Margaret, sister to Louis XVI. And he eventually became confessor to the royal family. And then the night before, on the 20th of January 1793, he was summoned to the temple where the king was imprisoned. He heard the king's final confession, said his final mass, and stayed with him overnight. So he would have known the final thoughts of Louis XVI. And the next morning then he accompanied him to the guillotine and ministered the final rites. And lucky enough he escaped.
So would he have been in danger himself?
Oh, he was in extreme danger, yeah. And in his report, he didn't wear his clerical garb. He wore plain clothes on that day.
To disguise the fact that he was actually doing what he was doing.
Yeah, and the soldiers actually, it was a gruesome period in French history.
The terror, as it was called.
The terror, yeah. And then the soldiers swung around Louis's head, and the abbey was splattered in blood in the reports of it, and he escaped then in the midst of the turmoil of the whole thing.
So at that stage, he was the Abbé Henri de Fermont.
That's right.
As they said.
And Fermont referred to the family estate that was here in Edgeworthstown. Yeah.
It's a long journey, isn't it? To come from the rectory here, through his father's conversion, to end up at the side of Louis XVI at the point of his execution.
It's remarkable. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Maria Edgeworth would have just turned 25 when these events involving her distant cousin were occurring in distant Paris. She had been born in England, but was now living in Edgeworthstown, helping her father become an improving landlord on their estate, and as yet hadn't published anything. But she was actively involved in the daily lives of their tenants, and she was listening and learning and beginning to write. In her novels, most notably in Castle Rackrent, she satirised the worst excesses of Anglo-Irish landlords, the class to which she herself belonged. And throughout her writing, she introduced a kind of realism and an authenticity of character and dialogue that did much to counteract the negative stereotypes and crude caricatures of the Irish peasantry that were so prevalent in English publications of the day. By far the greatest influence on Maria's life and thinking at this time was her father, Richard Lovell Edgeworth. Improving landlord, yes, but also an enlightened educationalist, an engineer, and a far-sighted inventor. After the Napoleonic Wars, the British government set up a commission to survey the bogs of Ireland with a view to raising revenue by extracting peat.
So Edgeworth was one of the commissioners on that, with his son William. And the commissioner's report was later used over 150 years by Bord na Móna at the establishment of Bord na Móna. And Edgeworth had laid out all the way of draining it, extracting the peat, as you said, the railway tracks, the whole lot.
So he not only foresaw all this, he planned all this.
He had planned all that.
And it was only 100 odd years after he died that they actually put it into operation.
Exactly.
Extraordinary.
Exactly, yeah.
And he had all sorts of ideas for education, which he actually put into practice here in Edgeworthstown. Wasn't that the case?
That's right, yeah. He established what was called an experimental school, and it was interdenominational. It was in a small little town in the middle of nowhere, and it had 500 pupils. And a lot of educationists from all over Europe came over to study Edgeworth's theories. And you may see later on in our library here, we have 2 copies of his publication. Himself and Maria collaborated on a practical education. And it goes into every aspect of education, from science, literature, gardening, even play, toys. And not alone that, but he organised that the local rector and the local Catholic priest came to the school on a Saturday, and the children received their religious instruction.
One of the things that perhaps less progressive about that, in spite of all of the other wonderful aspects of it, it was a school for boys.
It was a school for boys.
And only boys. So even his radical men couldn't envisage sending young girls to this sort of free education system.
Yeah, he hadn't probably advanced that far for some reason.
Yeah. But Mariah had.
Mariah had, yeah. And I don't think enough women realise the legacy that she has left behind, because she was one of the first female members of the Royal Irish Academy. And she was very friendly with William Rowan Hamilton, and we have letters where she writes to him, appealing to him to allow women into the academy.
Sir William Rowan Hamilton, William Wordsworth and Sir Walter Scott were just some of the luminaries to visit the Edgeworths at least once in the 1800s. But there was another literary figure a bit later in the century who was a frequent visitor to the village, though he spent most of his time in the graveyard of St. John's Church. His reasons for so doing we'll find out when we come back. In the year 1894, W.B. Yeats was compiling an anthology of Irish verse, and he contacted Oscar Wilde, seeking permission to include a poem of his entitled Requiescat. Oscar replied that it wasn't typical of his work, but he gave his permission nonetheless, and when the poem subsequently appeared in the anthology, it was hailed as the brightest gem in the collection. But it wasn't typical of his work. It had none of the glittering, witty flourishes for which Oscar Wilde had become famous. Requiescat was a poem about his sister Isola, who had died just 2 months short of her 10th birthday when Oscar himself was only 12. That death from meningitis, it's now thought, occurred here at the rectory in Edgeworthstown in the year 1867, where Isola had been convalescing in the care of her Aunt Margaret and her husband, the Reverend William Noble, who was rector here at that time. Margaret was a sister of Sir William Wilde, eminent Dublin surgeon and father of soon-to-be famous Oscar Wilde. Oscar was devastated by the death of his beloved younger sister and spent many solitary hours grieving in this churchyard where she had been buried. He penned his heartfelt and untypical poem, Requiescat, years later, and when he died, a lock of Isola's hair was found in an envelope among his possessions. Somewhat mysteriously, her original gravestone went missing, never to be found again. But in the year 2013, the townspeople commissioned this beautiful stone and had a verse of the poem inscribed on it. An infinitely more cheerful aspect of Edgeworthstown's heritage now in the shape of the infinitely cheerful Octavia Tulloch, who is the National Learning Network's horticultural instructor in what was the walled garden of the Edgeworth's former manor house, now pressed into service as a modern nursing home. Here students, mostly adult learners, will be instructed in all aspects of plant husbandry to the point where they will be equipped to work in various horticultural businesses. They might also be persuaded into a culinary career, because Octavia is a foraging expert and is keen to get us to appreciate the food value in what many people simply regard as weeds.
Right, now this is called Grand Elder, not related to the tree elder.
Right.
This was allegedly introduced to the UK by the Romans, but probably by the Normans to Ireland.
And it's grown as a vegetable or as a herb?
It was grown a vegetable, but it's not currently in fashion as a vegetable. Right. Although why, I don't know, because I have an incredible crop at home in my herbaceous border. That's all I have that's really successful right now.
You have to plant these deliberately. They're not going to grow wild or anything like that.
No, they do grow wild. And in fact, you will go to an old garden and you will see the only plant left will be this.
Really?
So it's almost a symbol of an old house, an old garden. So these grow up in amongst other plants. It's incredibly difficult to get rid of. It's described as a pernicious weed, and most gardeners would weep at the thought that you would be encouraging it in your garden.
You are encouraging it, in other words.
Well, I've given up.
Point.
Yes, it depends.
Right.
I've actually only recently started eating it, and I think actually its value.
So really what you
greater.
said, okay, if you insist on being in our garden,
Yes.
I will accommodate you and I will eat you as well.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
Exactly.
But I was saying to you earlier on that, yes, it's not the elder tree, it's not the same plant, but it's interesting that this place is called Mastrum, the old Irish name for it, Mastrum, which means the frontier of the elder. So there you are. But it's not this elder you're saying. It was probably an elder
do you know
tree.
what? It's growing here, so why not?
Why not? So you have lots of that.
Right.
You have this big plant which is insisting on coming out of the basket on its own.
It's hogweed, the normal hogweed.
The normal hogweed. And I know the giant hogweed is extremely dangerous plant because that burns your skin and everything, doesn't it?
Nasty blisters,
This is related to it,
This is related to it. So it's not something you would eat in large quantities, but people have started, foraging types and people who are into wild food have started forcing this like rhubarb. So putting a cover over it to encourage it to grow much larger, and then they're steaming it. And eating it as a vegetable.
And is it pleasant tasting? Is it? Have you
I haven't tried it yet.
Right, okay.
Maybe today would be the day, Joe.
Well, you can experiment on somebody else. Octavia, well, I don't know. I mean,
but also, this is what we used to eat.
really.
You know, before the supermarkets and the greengrocers existed,
So people ate an
Irish
awful lot.
people would have been eating this
Right.
and would have been surviving on this. Remember, after a long winter, there wouldn't have been any way of preserving green vegetables.
No.
And these are the first things up. So at the end of February, and a mild February, you would have been suddenly be able to have green vegetables again.
So there were vegetables like these,
Yes.
and possibly others as well,
yes,
that we have forgotten about. It all.
Exactly, yes. And we've forgotten how to eat them, we've forgotten how to use them. People don't even recognise them now.
This is a deep basket Octavia has me holding, and out of it she also produced cardamine hirsuta, or hairy bitter cress, which tastes a bit like cress, oddly enough. Dandelion, every part edible but not very tasty according to Octavia, and Gallium aperine, otherwise known by many names including goosegrass, cleavers and stickybacks as we call them. Tastes a bit like thin sandpaper to me, but has the added advantage that people of a certain mentality can actually wear it. Octavia warns not to eat anything strange to you unless you've researched it or have taken advice from an expert, which is exactly what I'm doing here. And it's back to the ground elder, which Octavia assures me makes a fine omelette. So in the wonderfully airy makeshift kitchen, which she has set up in one of the polytunnels. Now, the proof of the pudding, as they say, or the proof of the ground elder is in the eating. You're chopping up an awful lot of ground elder here.
It will
seems an awful lot.
Yeah, it will disappear to nothing.
Oh, it wilts away down, doesn't it?
It's disappeared already to nothing.
Yeah. I have never had an omelette with ground elder before in my life.
Right.
I love it with ground elder
Okay,
and
let's try
nutmeg
this.
and lemon and olive oil.
Let's try this. Right, here, we've got massive heat here. I should have given you this job.
No, it's just, you're doing well.
Thank you. Scatter it in. With the fork, spread it around, okay?
Yeah, it's not going to matter because we're not actually going to eat it or anything, sure we're not?
You are so going to eat it.
Right.
Smells good though.
It does indeed. I'm really looking forward to it, to be honest.
I'm not going to win, or we're not going to bring any prizes for a presentation possibly.
Well, given the circumstances, you know, here we are standing out in the spring equinox.
Spring equinox.
In the
And it was
place.
snowing actually.
And I don't think anybody's ever cooked in this place before.
No.
This is all set
This
up.
is all
especially.
this is a first, yeah.
This is brilliant.
Isn't that looking nice?
It's looking good. Looking good. Did you bring the Chardonnay with you as well? Did you by any chance? No?
But that was your job. You mean you forgot it?
Afraid so. That's delicious.
Really?
Really,
Oh,
really nice.
thank
Really
God.
nice. The Normans introduced a number of things to Ireland besides ground elder. Among them, the name Chewit, which is a popular name in Longford and which is proudly signed on this lady's works of art. Angela Chewit paints on silk, which seems to lend a shimmering, ethereal quality to everything she creates. Or maybe that's just Angela's feathery light deftness with a paintbrush. When I paid a visit to her front room studio in Edgeworthstown, she was busy collecting her works together for an exhibition about to open in the Backstage Theatre in Longford Town. But she graciously made time to do something else, to which she devotes endless patience and generosity. And that is convincing others that they too can do it. And these are for silk painting?
They're specifically for silk painting, yeah.
See,
yeah, you couldn't just use any old paint. You have to have silk paints. Right. And then when the whole painting is finished, you must iron it on the back. You must iron it on the reverse side.
When it's dry, presumably?
When it's dry.
With an iron, seriously?
Yeah, absolutely,
really?
yeah. And that sets the paint, yeah. That sets the paint, yeah. Now, it's important not to go too near the edges, because if you go too near the edges, it could spill over, you know. If you wanted to lighten the paint, you just use water, and that dilutes down the paint. If you want to darken it, a little bit of black or purples or whatever, you know, you just use a little bit of water to run that out here. Let the paint run, whatever.
Well, I mean, I'm just looking at your seascape up here, for example. I mean, colours are deliberately run onto there, aren't they? Yeah,
and the fabric itself, it's a great lustre in silk. Right. So when the paints, you know, it just creates a magical effect. You know, the paints on the actual fabric. I find it very, very nice to paint.
Kind of luminance inside the material itself.
Yes, yes. I'll just finish out this one, and I'll let you do another one, Joe.
Okay.
No
you
pressure.
see, this is what I worry about. What I worry about is that you go to a lot of bother. Silk, for whatever you say, is not a cheap material, I would imagine. It's
not. No, it is. It was a very valuable material going back in years. You know, it was very precious material. It still is, and it's still, but it's lovely to work on. You know, and I enjoy.
If you can work on it, that is right.
Okay, so
this is why I'm slightly terrified about making a mark on it, because I don't want to.
Right. Okay.
Is it a forgiving material?
As I always say to my students, there's no such thing as a mistake in art. It doesn't exist.
You could be quietly seething there watching me doing this.
No, it's
disguising
beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It is lovely. That poppy is jumping out. Yep, very nice.
All right, don't go overboard. And so, a little later, another Angela Tuitt is in the making. Well, 99% Angela Tuitt. What was it I said about Angela's generosity?